we've got some areas that we're going to be covering today. And I'm going to be putting some questions to Carol, talking about various different areas of teaching pre-primary children in the ELT classroom. We are also taking questions, so if you'd like to ask questions as we're going along, we'll try to answer them at the time as much as possible, but we will also dedicate some time at the end of the session to cover a lot of the questions that you ask. So please do put them in the chat box, and don't worry, we are keeping a tab on them, and we'll address those once we've finished going through sort of the main bulk of the session. So any questions, just whack them in the chat box. Okay, Carol, should we get started?
Okay, let's get started, Will. What on earth you asked me?
Okay, all right, so my first question, Carol, you've written course books for preschool children, and you've taught them, as we've just discussed, you've taught them over many years. What would you say is the most essential thing for teachers to keep in mind?
That's a very good question. That's the multi-million-dollar one, isn't it? And I think I'd say that the most essential thing to keep in mind is actually a whole child approach. In other words, an approach where we focus on all aspects of the children's development, their social, cognitive, physical, emotional, psychological, creative, and language development. Of course, language development is important. We're language teachers after all, but this is only one aspect, and it shouldn't dominate or exclude everything else. And actually, the paradox is that by focusing on all aspects of children's development, they actually learn more language. And let me give you a little example to illustrate what I mean.
Sure.
If we teach children a counting song with actions, for example, Will, I'm sure you know the song with your little boy, 5.
Oh no, you're going to test me now, aren't you?
Swimming one day. No, I'm not going to test you. Okay. Well, but if we do that song, you know the song, 5 little ducks go swimming one day, over the pond and far away. Mummy ducks goes quack, 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 but only 4 little ducks come back. So actually what's happening in a song like that, we've got social development through joining in and singing with others. We've got psychological development through relating to the ducks getting lost. We've got emotional development, the pleasure in participation and empathy with the ducks. We got the physical development, the coordinating the actions of swimming over the pond in time to the rhythm of the song. We've got cognitive development, we're counting backwards, associating numbers with the ducks, and creative thinking, you know, imagining why don't the ducks come back immediately. And of course, we've got language development there, numbers 1 to 5, other language and vocabulary, pond, swim, etc. But of course, a whole child approach depends on the way we do it. If we just focus on language and number practice, we're missing out on giving children a more enjoyable, memorable, and valuable learning experience. And catering for the whole child is something that's always paramount in my mind when I write materials for this age group. I'm always asking myself, how do activities, lessons, and units of work contribute to different aspects of children's development and not just language? Now, of course, I can't put all that information for every activity in my teacher's books, otherwise they'd be real tomes. But anyone using my materials, I think they will see how they cater for children's multiple developmental needs. And it's this that makes them engaging and motivating and effective for all learners. So in a whole child approach, we create natural contexts which enable children to construct relevant personal meaning and interact in the social context of the classroom in purposeful ways using age-appropriate multisensory techniques. But at the same time, given the limited time of English lessons, this also means careful and systematic language planning, as well as frequent opportunities to repeat language, use it in different contexts and for different purposes in order to build children's confidence and develop their working memories. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the most powerful ways of organizing learning in a whole child approach is through stories. You know, Jerome Bruner talks about how it's through storytelling that children construct their identities. And I suspect that this is equally true when they're learning English as well as their mother tongue.
Right. Thank you, Carol. Well, actually, let's keep on the subject of stories. I think I'm sure I speak for a lot of the teachers here when I say that there's so much material out there to choose from, so many different stories that they can select to teach and to use and to exploit in their classrooms. What do you think would be the key criteria for selecting the right stories?
Yeah, I think that's so important because you're absolutely right, Will. We're just bogged down with choice for stories. And I think key criteria for choosing stories, certainly the criteria that I actually keep in mind when I'm writing my own stories. Number one criteria is that it is a real story. Even young children, they will detect a language practice dialogue masquerading as a story. Mm-hmm. So we need a real beginning, middle, and end. We need some kind of problem, conflict, and resolution. And in terms of the content, it needs to be relevant, interesting, appropriate, memorable. It obviously needs to relate to the topic you're doing and or link to other areas of the curriculum. It's nice to have humor, you know, 3, 4, 5-year-old humor. They love it. And it's wonderful when you understand humor in another language. And I think it often helps to have a balance of fantasy and reality. Reality in the sense of situations that children can relate to. And I think it's often helpful as well to have familiar characters that children get to know in the stories. Of course, another thing we need to think of, obviously, is language and a level of difficulty. And that children need to be able to have a global understanding from the context. So we need to balance the amount of receptive and productive language. And we also need to think about the discourse pattern of stories. So, for example, with very young children, useful patterns are repetitive ones or cumulative ones, where we add something additional to each sentence. Yes. Or perhaps they use alliteration or rhyme or have a question and answer pattern. And another thing with this age group is that it's very helpful to have direct speech in the stories that children can transfer and use purposefully in other contexts. For example, you know, can you help me please? Do you want to play? So actual chunks of language that they can then use. Our stories need to have opportunities for participation, prediction, joining in with repeated phrases, retelling them, acting them out. And of course, what's hugely important at this age, because we've got no text, are the visuals, that they need to be attractive and clear. They mustn't be over busy or confusing. And the pictures and text need to be in sync. So they need to be conveying the same message. In other words, supporting children's understanding of the story. Mm-hmm. We also want to make sure they're not giving stereotype messages. For example, often, you know, you see grannies with grey hair and pearls in children's picture books, and grannies just aren't like that these days. So you've got to watch out for that as well. And perhaps it's also important to have multiple modes for telling the story. So you've got images, and maybe you've got audio, and you've also got video. And I think real children's illustrators have this feeling for this. And that was why I was so thrilled that Nacho, you know, did the illustrations for Mimi's Wheel, because he is a children's illustrator. and understood, exactly the needs of children learning English.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, there are other things as well. We have to think about the thinking skills the story develops, young children being able to understand cause and effect, or to sequence things. And of course, we want them also to develop creative and critical thinking. And we need to think of the kind of values that we're promoting in the story.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of personal, moral, and social values are there? Things like kindness and empathy and making an effort. And also, global issues, if you like, things like exclusion, inclusion, rather than exclusion, anti-bullying, gender equality, respect for different races and ethnicities. All of that kind of thing is really, really, really important.
Yeah.
So lots of criteria there.
Lots of criteria. Well, I mean, have you got a shortcut for all that, Carol? Do you know anywhere in particular where they can? Is there a bank of stories that you could recommend, perhaps, or some banks that you could recommend for?
Well, I think there are so many that are out there, actually. I mean, I think, if you look at children's picture books, absolutely rich with stories that don't necessarily meet the language criteria I was talking about, because they haven't been written with second language learners in mind. But certainly with the other criteria, yes. And there's something we need to give time for children to ponder on what they've learned. Absolutely, I quite agree with that. Yeah. No, definitely.
Brilliant. Well, actually, I mean, sticking with stories, just one more time, Carol, if you don't mind. So you've spoken about how to choose a story and what makes a good story for that particular environment. How would you actually go about doing that then? So you've got the story, you've got your class in front of you, ready to go. How would you conduct that lesson?
Oh, that's quite a question. Well, that's a question I think people who know my materials probably would know how I would want to do that. I mean, to start off with, I'd certainly would see it as a cyclical process, whereby you actually come back to the story several times in a unit of work. And what you do is you move from a global understanding of the story through to acting it out and drawing the children in to using the language. Mm-hmm. So you have to start off, obviously, by creating interest, motivation, and attention in the story. You want to do activities that are going to possibly pre-teach any vocabulary that they need to know, but you don't need to pre-teach vocabulary that's understandable from the story. You need to motivate the children to want to listen by asking a focus question or so, and then just let them enjoy the story, actually. Something that I feel passionately about. Sometimes as teachers, we actually kill stories to death by asking too many questions. What colour is Mimi's coat? What colour is the sky? And actually, no, let's not interrupt the actual pleasure of the story. And I think something else in a class situation, we need to remember never to just tell the story again in the same way. We always need to do something different with it, because it's different with a child at home. They just want to sit on your lap and hear the story again. But in a classroom situation, children will say, "Oh, we've done that before." So we have to add that that surprise factor to make them interested in doing it. And that might be something as simple as holding up picture cards when you listen to the story, or putting your hands on your head when a particular character speaks, and so on. I mean, I think also what we need to do, because our idea with these stories is that they are a vehicle for understanding language, which we later want the children to be able to transfer to other personalized and real world contexts. So we have to create those. So for example, if we have a story where a character has been saying, "Can you give me whatever it is?" we want to then translate that into a classroom activity. And we might have, you know, our flashcards on the carpet and ask the children, can you give me a, so they're making the connection between that language in the story and how they can use it. And the other key thing, I think, is to personalize and to give children, as I like to say, choice and voice, so that, you know, after, say they've been listening to a story about some food as a favorite treat, then we might get them to draw their favorite treat, to tell each other their favorite. It's really, really important. And so that's, you know, how I'd go about doing it.
Okay.
And I think in terms of, yeah, sorry, I thought, yeah, go on.
No, you could carry on, Carol. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I was just going to say about telling a story, because I think it's really important, because teachers often say to me that they don't feel very comfortable telling stories. And I think we have to remember that there are as many ways of telling a story as there are teachers. And, you know, we must never force things or try and do things in a way that doesn't come naturally to us. And I've heard stories being told in ways that are incredibly exuberant and extrovert, and also stories being told in a very, very restrained and quiet way. And both ways can be equally effective. And the other thing I would say, and I know it's all very well for me as a, you know, an English speaker, but we all have different accents, but actually that has nothing to do with it. The important thing is that we are competent as teachers and intelligible as speakers. It doesn't matter what your accent is, whether you're from, you know, wherever, the north of England, the south, you know, it's intelligibility, as any of the sort of pronunciation experts these days will tell you. So yes, and I think also, of course, you need to make the most of your voice, your eyes, and your body. You need to make story time into a pleasant ritual and preempt classroom management problems, because that's really disappointing if you have classroom management problems when you're telling a story. So, for example, one thing I do is actually get children to take their index finger, if you can see that there when they're sitting on the carpet, and draw a magic circle around themselves, and that is their space. No one can come in their space, and they mustn't go out of the space, and that stops all this kind of jostling kind of stuff when you're telling a story. And you can also get children's attention, you know, by saying a simple rhyme. So, for example, it's time for a story. 1, 2, 3. Are you ready? Listen to me. So I do that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carol. I mean, yeah, as you said, I'm sort of experiencing it a little bit first person at the moment with I've got a 2-year-old, and I had no idea that there were other ways of telling a story, because I'd never really experienced it. And I told a story, we told stories to my little boy at home. And then I did the same, I told the story the same way when I was with my parents, and they were flabbergasted. They were really surprised at the way I was doing the story. And I thought, isn't that how everybody did it? And it was only at that moment that I realized that, I really liked what you said then about there are as many ways to tell a story as there are teachers in the world. And I think that's yeah, it hit home at that moment.
I think that's really important. And the other thing that goes with that is to make sure, you know, it's best to choose stories that you like yourself. That's key, because like it or not, you'll transmit how you feel about it to the children. And if you do like the story, show and share your enjoyment, because it's very infectious. If you enjoy it, you know, the children will too. And yeah, I think one other thing actually that I saw in the chat box, you know, going by very fast there, is to give children time with stories. You know, give them time to assimilate what's happening, to comment on it, to ask questions, and be sensitive to their responses, encouraging them to tell you if they've had similar experiences or felt like any of the characters. And sometimes, if appropriate, you can ask them, what they think we can learn from the story as well.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Carol. Well, if you don't mind, should we move on from stories a little bit? We've got other things to cover. So I've got another question, if you don't mind. I was going to change the subject. Is that all right? So, as per in previous webinars that you've held and feedback from the teaching community in pre-primary, there's always this question around free play and how much structure you should be allowing students when they're in classroom, when they want them to sort of express themselves and feel freedom. Do you think that there is place for free play as part of these language lessons with young children, or do you think there always should be some element of structure in there?
Right. That's a great question, Will. And it's also quite a challenging one as well, as I'm sure people listening will also feel. And structured games and free play both have an important role to play. And I think structured games rather than the play, develop children's ability to follow instructions, to develop cognitive skills such as logical deduction, matching and memory, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And they also provide specific focused learning of vocabulary or structures and repeated practice. And as teachers, we use them all the time in our lessons. For example, games that I'm sure you all know, what's missing, what's in the bag, guessing games, what's the puppet thinking about, memory games, action games, and so on. And those are all very well, and they have a hugely important role, as I'd just like to explain in a moment. Mm-hmm. But as well as that, we do need to try and include free play. Because from child development theory, from a socio-constructivist point of view, people like, Vygotsky and other writers, Bodrova, Moyles, Bruce, anybody out there who knows this literature, it is through free play that children have opportunities to experiment and internalize thought and language. And this helps them to become more autonomous, self-regulating, and responsible. So there's quite a dilemma here for us as language teachers, because we feel understandably very nervous about allowing free play in our lessons. Because what's going to happen? They're all going to talk in their own language. We only have 20 minutes or half an hour, and we feel we must use that for direct teaching and input. And also sometimes, some children get excluded or don't participate in free play, and we may have massive management problems. So what can we do? And I would like to suggest that it is through the creation of formats, to borrow from Bruner's term. And Bruner says something like, and I'm quoting more or less, a format is a routinized and repeated interaction in which adults and children do things together. So, in other words, a format is exactly like those kind of structured games we so frequently play, what's missing, guess what in the bag, etc., with every lexical set we introduce. So what happens? Through the repetition of those formats, children become familiar with the language and procedure involved, and this builds their confidence and motivation, and they kind of know it, the procedure, by heart. Mm-hmm. And what happens when they have opportunities for free play, they tend to naturally use the familiar language and procedure of the format in their own independent and creative ways. But the question is, how can we give them opportunities to do this in our lessons? And in my experience, the best thing we can do is to set up what I call, and gets called in the literature, learning stations. Sometimes they're called hubs. In other words, a space in your classroom that is resourced with materials you've used during your teacher-led activities and structured games. So for example, you might leave your puppet there, some flashcards, some story cards, and so on. And to start off with, you only need 1 or 2 learning stations. And the idea is that children take turns to alternate completing an activity sheet at their tables to visiting the learning stations you've set up in pairs or small groups. Pairs is easier to manage, of course. And you need to establish certain norms. For example, using our quiet voices, and encourage, but not insist on, you can't anyway, English. And you also need to keep a close eye. But what actually happens when you do this is children tend to replicate or do their own creative versions of activities and games that they've done with you in class, using familiar vocabulary and chunks of language that they've learned, but also, of course, they're mixing languages and they correct and help each other. In fact, the favorite game children play is often being teacher. And it's kind of amazing how they love playing being the teacher. They're very good at it. They parody you and they correct each other and tell each other off, and it's a great game. So I think if we can create learning stations, and even if we only have a little time for that, we actually give opportunity to children to develop that ownership of language and develop their responsibility and agency and autonomy. So I don't know if that's clear.
Absolutely. It's clear to me, I think. No,
I'm just looking in the chat to see if there are any messages. That's fine. Good.
Yeah, well, we've got a large selection of questions mounting here, Carol. So we'll have plenty to talk about afterwards. Okay, so moving on to another topic, which is very prevalent nowadays, given COVID, but I think also in the run up to COVID as well. I think social emotional learning was something that has certainly taken the limelight in the last year or so. So zooming in on preschool students for social emotional learning, do you think that's something that should be addressed in that environment? And how could it be addressed in that environment as well?
Okay, well, I think it's absolutely vital, pandemic or no pandemic. I've thought that for quite a long time, and certainly, when I was writing Mimi's Wheel and so on before the pandemic, there's a huge emphasis on social and emotional learning. And I think it's really, really important. It covers, a huge areas such as self-awareness, self-esteem, managing emotions, self-regulation, relating to other people, developing social skills. I mean, it really is a huge umbrella for a lot of things. And it underpins children's confidence, self-esteem, and mental and physical well-being. So you asked me how we go about it. And I think there are 2 main ways. And the first way is actually through looking for every single opportunity to develop and enhance social and emotional learning within all aspects of our teaching. So someone like Michael Byram, he uses the term permeation. He's talking about intercultural awareness, of course, but I like that term for social and emotional learning too. Or another one that's used actually by Carol McGuinness in relation to thinking skills, and she talks about infusion. And both of those give the idea, the term I sort of tend to use is osmosis, that we're doing it by osmosis. And when we're doing it by osmosis, there are many different ways, which are not rocket science, but they're hugely important, that we're doing things like we're creating a warm and caring learning environment, we're modeling the kind of behavior, values, and attitudes that we want the children to adopt, and we're giving clear demonstrations. So it's, social and emotional learning by example. For example, using please and thank you, greetings, eye contact, friendly smile, all of that. Also through the kinds of praise and positive and encouragement and feedback that we give, and focusing on effort and behavior as well as achievement. And another thing is through setting clear expectations and parameters of behaviour, that children have a right and also a need to know what you want them to do. And we also have to, even though they're very young and you may think not very capable, we have to give them opportunities for choice and decision making, even in little ways. You know, which order are they going to do the activities? How are they going to complete a project? And so on. So there's that osmosis side. And then there's the explicit instruction side. And here we can do activities to develop specific aspects. So, for example, feelings. It's very important to teach children the vocabulary of feelings, you know, happy, sad, angry, scared, sleepy. You know, we can then play a game, you know, mime and guess. You can tell me how I'm feeling, Will.
I wouldn't like to say, Carol. I wouldn't like to say.
You wouldn't like to say. Okay, well, that was meant to be sad. Okay.
Okay.
Or we could throw and catch our feelings. You know, I could be very happy and I could throw it to you and you would catch it and be very happy. Okay. We can obviously tell stories that integrate certain aspects. You know, for example, a story about a new friend at school, which develops empathy. We could do, you know, little rhymes to get children to cooperate. For example, you can do this one with me. We clap our hands. Okay, so we go, let's work together. Let's cooperate. That's it. I help you. You help me. It's great. It's great. Okay.
Yeah.
Or, for example, to get children settled down. You know, we want them to be quiet. So we might do a little rhyme. I'm quiet as a mouse, as still as can be.
I'm doing it as well. Okay.
No noise at all. Look at me. Okay. So, so examples then. So I think, yes, very important by osmosis and by explicit activities. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Carol. Okay. So moving on again, not moving on too far away from that, but another hot topic, I suppose, for lack of a better word. Talking about 21st century skills, life skills, global skills, whatever you call them. I think there's lots of terms for them, but specifically such as creative thinking and critical thinking. Do you think it's important or possible to incorporate these into preschool classrooms?
I think absolutely, definitely. And not only is it possible, but I think it's very important that we do. And I think in terms of creativity, we need to think about what gets called, you know, big C creativity and little c creativity. And obviously in macro terms, big C creativity is to do with original ideas and artifacts that are sort of universally significant. You know, Velázquez, Picasso, Mozart, Beethoven, you know, that kind of thing. And little c creativity, and this term was actually coined by Anna Kraft in 2001. Her writings on creativity are wonderful. And in its macro sense, it's to do with everyday creativity. In other words, your kind of personal effectiveness in coping well and identifying and making choices. So the reason I've mentioned both of those is because I think we have to think of how those actually translate into the classroom with our preschool children. And in that context, big C creativity is to do with creative learning outcomes that obviously don't have universal significance, but they are of personal value. In other words, they constitute original thinking for that child at that moment and are valued by the people around them, their teachers, their parents, and so on.
Right.
And little c creativity is to do with the everyday process of making sense and constructing meaning in the kind of Vygotskian sense from everything that goes on in the interaction with teachers and with peers in the social context of the classroom. In other words, the kind of creativity that is to do with communicating and expressing your meaning in the language available. Now, the challenge for us as teachers is that we need to provide opportunities for both kinds of creativity. So an original and big C creative outcome for a child might, for example, be the way they act out being a giant in a story, or it might be drawing a picture, imagining what happens after the end of the story, or it might be categorizing picture cards according to their own creative criteria, when you allow them to think of the criteria and not tell them. And the little c creative outcomes, which are often the ones we forget about, these occur when you give children opportunities to try and express their personal meanings. So actually a little bit what's going on in learning stations and free play that we talked about earlier. And I'm sure many of the participants there who are teaching preschool will have examples of this. I have wonderful examples from my own teaching. For example, when I was teaching in a Spanish preschool some years ago, and we were doing colours and some new colours, and we had white, and I held up white and the child shouted out, blank, blank. And of course, because it's blanco in Spanish, and you know, it had turned out he knew the word elephant, which had been elefante. And so there he was making his own creative hypothesis. Or, you know, the child in a weather routine. And I go over to the window as I normally do and, you know, ask, what's the weather like today? And the child goes, it's sunny, cloudy, sunny, cloudy. Because we don't have a word for sunny, cloudy. No, we don't. It's very, we should. It's very often sunny, cloudy.
That's our entire summer. Why haven't we got a word for that, Carol? We so should have a word for that.
Perhaps you haven't got a word because it's just cloudy normally. Yeah. But it's that kind of creativity that we must also kind of leave room for. And well, you asked me about critical thinking as well. And of course, people are going to say to me, well, critical thinking, come on, 4 to 6 year olds, how can they be doing critical thinking? But I think what we're talking about here is actually laying the foundations for critical thinking. And what we're going to do is get children to be able to draw on their existing knowledge and experience to predict, for example, to predict a story, but actually probe a little further. You know, you predict the story. Why do you think that? Okay, getting children to think about different points of view and options. You know, what else could Mimi do? How does Katie feel in the story? You know, whatever story it is. And you know, if you're worried that obviously children wouldn't be able to tell you that in English, then you may think that that's also absolutely fine. If you understand the children's language or the shared classroom language, then you can feel that answer and recast it, you know, knowing that you're actually developing those critical thinking skills. Other ways, for example, and it's lovely when you do this with small children, you know, you should try asking your little boy, you know, what's the difference between a giraffe and an elephant? You know, just actually, you know, to think about that and to explain and justify their opinions. And there are also, you know, there are activities that we can do to get them to think about, you know, differences between fact and opinion or how they know, you know, a game which is it true? So you ask, is it true grass is green? Okay. But then the key next thing is, how do you know? How do you know? So how do you know? You know, I see it in the park or whatever it is. So actually, you know, by gently probing children's thinking and actually get them to explain, to justify, to evaluate, all those kind of things, we are laying those foundations for critical thinking later on, you know, and at the beginning of primary, in a story, we could actually ask children to identify, you know, what is a fact in the story and what is opinion, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yes, really, really important.
Wow, thank you very much, Carol. Okay, well, I think we've got maybe time for one more before we start moving on to the audience. So this is quite a large question. I'll ask it, and then hopefully that leaves a bit of time for some questions from the audience as well. We can't talk about pre-primary classrooms, I don't think, without talking about classroom management. So let's assume that the teachers are here. I'm sure they're not all, but let's assume that every teacher here is in the scenario where they've got 25 or more pre-primary students in their ELT classroom. Have you got any pearls of wisdom, Carol, for dealing with that scenario?
I think I've got lots of pearls. I don't know how wise they are.
All right, we're happy with that.
My critical thinking skills, my prediction was that you would definitely at some point ask me this question. Right. And I feel very passionately and very strongly that we need to adopt an approach that is proactive rather than reactive. And that in preschool, we have got a chance, a really good chance, because they've only just started school, to train them in good habits. So the first really key thing is to establish learning routines in relation to any area of classroom life where it will help you and the children to have a familiar procedure to follow. So there's going to be your opening routines, your closing routines, tidy up routines. We did an example of story time routine, or rather I talked about that earlier. Because these learning routines frame your lessons. Children know what to do. You don't have to explain. You save your voice, you save your energy, and everyone feels confident about what they have to do. At the same time, you must never, ever take anything for granted in terms of children's skills and knowing how to behave. They don't, especially the 3-year-olds when they just started. So you need to be ready to explain, show, and demonstrate repeatedly and frequently. And you need to set and communicate clear expectations. How can children do what you want if you don't tell them? So, for example, we raise our arms. Remember, we raise our arms when we want to speak. Another thing that's really helpful, I think, is to use visual rules, because children can see the message, okay? And especially if you're obviously wanting to convey this as much as possible in English. So we walk, we listen. And these rules need to be framed positively. It's not don't run, don't shout, okay? It's, be... Walk and listen. Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, we also need to have, I would also just, a health warning. There are 2 stages, and this is following research suggests that there are 2 stages where classroom management problems happen. The first one is transitions between stages of lesson and moving to another part of the classroom. That's very often when things are going to break down and you're going to have chaos. So you need to have, some kind of transition chart. It might just be, we're off to our tables, 1, 2, 3, we get everybody marching to their tables and sitting down in an orderly way rather than having chaos and then spending 5 minutes, trying to get everyone sitting down together. So transitions is one area where things break down. And the other is if children don't have something to do, as simple as that. So if you're playing a game, Simon Says or something like, actually I never play Simon Says and have children going out. I know I never have them going out of the game. Everyone participates because that's the point. If you play Simon Says and you have children out of the game and they've got nothing to do, they're just waiting for the game to finish, that's when you're going to have problems. Okay.
They'll look to the board that you put up on the wall for ideas of how to cause trouble. What shouldn't I do? I think I might do that.
Exactly. Then, of course, it's to do with, varied and balanced activities. I'm sure a lot of you here are, familiar with the stir settle concept, which is Susan McLennan, she wrote about it in ELTJ way back when, 1987. But it's such a useful concept, so that if you do a very lively activity, you get children being lions around the classroom, you then have to plan and think about how you're going to get those lions sitting down and paying attention and behaving themselves afterwards. So you need to balance that. And I think also, of course, you need to give constructive feedback and praise and acknowledge positive behavior. Well done, Will, for waiting your turn.
Thank you. Very good.
Okay, so my main message about it is that overall it's much more effective to focus on positive discipline and what children do right, rather than responding reactively and punitively on what they do wrong. And I just seeing in the chat box, everybody should be involved and engaged. That's absolutely number one. Exactly. Engaging lessons, and you'll keep them with you. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carol, very, very much. That was great. I think I've fired enough questions at you. My part, but it's not over yet, Carol. I'm afraid you're not out of the firing line. Firing analogy. Anyway, so we've had some questions. If it's all right, I wanted to put a few to you from the teaching community that we've just had.
Please do.
So the first one is from Sarah in Georgia, and it's about parents. And she's asked how to help the parents to appreciate the teacher's work. She says when she tries to get this lessons to be fun, funny, multisensory and interesting, the parents feel that they're just entertaining their children and there's no learning going on. How would you help in that situation?
I think it's a very good question, and it's a very common problem because parents don't necessarily understand how children learn, and they don't see the connection between those kind of multisensory play-based activities that we're doing. So I think actually fundamental to all of that is creating a very strong homeschool link, and that that there needs to be regular communication and information going to parents about the kinds of activities you're doing in class, what the outcomes are going to be, how the parents can support those at home. I mean, it's really to do with parent training and parent, education. And possibly also, I mean, you'd need permission from parents to do this, but actually videoing one of your lessons to actually show, how children are working together. So I would say, it's regular information, regular meetings with parents. Possibly, I mean, it's not always possible. I know in some places where I've worked, it hasn't been. But if you can organise, meetings with parents, so they can ask you, questions, and you actually have an opportunity to explain the methodology and the kind of outcomes you can expect to achieve during the preschool years. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Okay, so Donya has asked, what's the best way to deal with preschool children who do not listen to their teacher?
I was about to say, who do not listen to their teacher. Okay.
That was the question, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good question. And I think one of the things we have to do in general, and I would say this is also for listening, is to actually give children pro-social reasons for doing things. Okay, so actually, why is it important to listen? So you can understand what we're going to do next. So you know when it's playtime or whatever. And I think another way, which also maybe is going to sound paradoxical, but is actually to not focus on it too much, because sometimes it can drive you as teacher to distraction when you feel that a child is not listening to you or paying any attention. And what our human instinct is to do is to go up for that child, you know, listen, and to go on negatively at that child when actually 26 others may be listening to you very well. So ignoring is sometimes a positive tactic.
A more productive tactic, yeah, for the rest of the class. Okay, I'm going to fire some more at you, Carol. We've had quite a lot, so I'm just going to go for the next one. So a really interesting question, actually, from Nabila. And I think depending on your answer, it could be an entire session of its own. It could be a really interesting session. So what first week activities would you suggest for preschool children on their first day or in their first week of face-to-face education?
Oh, that's lovely. Whose question is that?
That's Nabila.
Okay, lovely, Asnabila. It's a very nice question, and I think, and it's a lovely question. I think the really important thing is for children to have immediate takeaways from the lesson. So
immediate takeaways, right?
Immediate takeaways. You want them to be able to go away that they can do this in English. Okay. I mean, one of the things I do with my little ones, I've done it for years, and they love it, is cumulative actions. Okay, it's a kind of TPR. So, you know, on the first day we might just learn, you know, jump, I don't know, jump, run on the spot, something like that, and then we keep on adding to them. And it's really amazing how, as a routine, children, you know, remember that. So that actually, that's slightly going off piece, because it's not with the very first lesson. But the first lesson, it must also be personal. There must be a takeaway to go home to show something to your mum and dad. You know, look what I've done in my lesson. Maybe I've drawn a self-portrait, and I can say, you know, my eyes, my nose, my mouth, whatever it is. I mean, whatever it is. I think it's that the takeaway idea. Plus, you know, establishing the relationship and the routines. So a hello song, you're going to meet the puppet, you're going to sit in a circle, you know, maybe say hello to the puppet, or maybe you don't dare say hello, but you can wave to the puppet, you know, gradually. I don't know if that
No, I'm sure that does answer the question. Thank you, Carol. It's a really nice question. It's just a nice image, isn't it, to imagine kids on their first day of school.
Yeah, but it's that, yeah. What you want to avoid is kids going home and the parents say, so what did you do today, darling, in your lesson? And they say, you know, nothing. You've got to have something to show for it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just trying to scroll down to find these questions. Okay, so Swapna is asking, how effective would it be to read a story from a book in an online class? Or if you've got any perhaps suggestions for in an online environment reading stories.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I was reading something just the other day about this, and I'm sorry because I can't quite remember where it was, but it was about preschool children and their response to online materials. And what it was recommending was that actually, rather than you sitting there with the picture book open, it's more engaging for children if they see the whole story on the screen. Now, of course, there are copyright issues with that, depending on what you're using, but So I guess if it's not going out, further in the classroom, then it's okay. But I found that quite interesting. And another thing that I also found interesting is that actually during the first lockdown last year, I made 12, well, it's actually 24 with the teaching tip, story videos for teachers and parents to use at home. And one of the things that teachers have told me, because I've had loads of emails and letters about these stories, and they've told me that one of the ways they like to use it is to, use it in their online classes, because the children are getting the story, they're getting it from someone else, not their teacher, but they can engage with it directly, and then the teacher can follow up using and reinforcing some of the ideas and activities that have been done. And I think you could adopt that, for example, with picture illustrator read alouds, because during the lockdown a lot of children's authors recorded readings of their stories to support parents and children.
Right.
So I think you could do that. No, I think it's a very good question, because there is that gap of immediacy. You've got the screen.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Carol. So another question. So we've had Switter has asked an online period for a 3-year-old child. What would you say? How long should it be?
5 minutes. I mean, I've 3-year-old children, in order to make it engaging for 3-year-old children, you have to have very short activities. You have to have lots of movement, dance, singing, action, scavenger activity. Well, there's a parent going to be present probably as well, but go and find something green. It has to be very, very active. And I mean, people who during the pandemic have been talking to their grandchildren, say, I know people who've had that, talking to them online, and say, the grandchildren only pay attention for about 3 minutes and then they're distracted. So I think the answer is short, and there's no point trying to make a 3-year-old sit in front of a screen for 20 minutes. They can't sit still on a carpet for 20 minutes. So why should they be able to sit on a screen, in front of a screen? So I think, basically, as they get older, they can cope with a little bit more. But for 3-year-olds, I think it's really challenging. And you need to use techniques with 3-year-olds that engage the parents with them. So, for example, one thing that, you would recommend that the parents get is a mini whiteboard, for example, so that then the children, you could say, show me red on your mini whiteboard, and they could hold it up, but you're doing that with the support of the parent. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. All right, one more question, Carol, and I think it's the most important question we've had in today's conversation. It is the most important question. Are you ready for this?
Really? More important than classroom management?
Yeah, more important than classroom management, more important than 21st century skills, social emotional learning.
What
stories.
is it going to be? My God.
It's why did you choose a meerkat as a puppet?
Oh, well, I think that's a lovely question, because, well, meerkats, for a start, they stand on 2 legs, so very often. So they're quite humanoid in that respect. And also, I mean, although there's more to meerkats than meet the eye, they do have a reputation of being very social, cooperative animals, that they work together. When you see a documentary about meerkats in the desert, they have meerkats on guard, looking out.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they kind of they fitted in with my kind of concept of a whole child approach to learning, as animals, that are social and cooperative. And I think having a family like that, which is a kind of fantasy family, but they do very realistic things, also allows all kinds of different children to relate to that. You know, because the meerkats are obviously not exactly their family, but everybody can relate to it. So yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that insight, Carol. That was lovely. And thank you very much for being with us today. It was a really, really great experience. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it a lot. I enjoyed predicting your questions.
Did you predict all of them?
And fielding all the other questions. I mean, there's so much to talk about here, but yeah, no, great.
Brilliant. I think you've covered really well, sort of a wide net for pre-primary teachers. So I'm sure it's been beneficial to everyone who's watching today. And thank you also to Anna Hasper, who is there in the background. She is the person frantically keeping us up to date with the questions you're asking, making sure you've got all your questions answered as well. So thank you very much for your help, Anna. As always, you're an absolute diamond. So thank you very much for being with us. And thank you for the teaching community. It was wonderful. Sorry, Carol.
No, I was just saying thank you to Anna, and thank you for all these lovely messages I'm seeing in the chat box. That's very nice, and I hope it's been helpful.
Well, I think I'm going to finish in a minute. I've got something I wanted to show you, talk to you about. This is something Carol's put together recently, and hopefully this will help you with all sorts of other things that you're doing at the moment in your pre-primary classroom. So you've come to this session today. It was an interview with Carol Reed on teaching pre-primary children. So I can only imagine that this will be a website that's of interest to you too. If you were to, I'm just going to get the website here actually, so I can look at it because I'm not looking at it. So this new website by Carol is Hop on the Learning Wheel. It's got all sorts of things in there. We've got teaching tips to help your classes go more smoothly. There are videos from Carol Reed on there as well, as you'll see. Lots of short videos. You've got new content. There are tips videos, instant resources, previous webinars on pre-primary students, teaching pre-primary as well. I've just put the link just above me in red. So have a look at that, and I hope you enjoy it. It's all there. It's all for you, and it's all free. So go and take a look.